You're listening to the Churchosity Podcast, where we talk about the Gen X take on church culture. Welcome to another episode of the Churchosity Podcast. My name is Heath Brady, and I'm your host.
My name is Andrea Brady, and I'm your co-host.
We're just a couple of Gen X Christians trying to give our perspective on church culture. And this podcast is dedicated to the Gen X Christians.
You know, the ones who just want to keep it simple.
The ones who just want to live quiet and peaceable lives.
We represent the generation of Christians who sometimes looks at what others are doing and thinks, whatever. But as it says in 1 Timothy 1:5,
the goal of our instruction is love, from a pure heart, and from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith. So, Andy?
Yes?
Our listeners may not be aware of the fact that podcasting history is being made right this very moment.
Yes, it is.
Because guess what, listeners of Churchosity? You're listening to the 50th episode of the Churchosity Podcast. How crazy is that?
That's pretty exciting.
50 stinking episodes, man. Yeah, so, you know, it's kind of ironic, and we'll unpack this a little bit as we go, but
yeah.
we've our little podcast has grown quite a bit, especially within the last few months. And a lot of our new listeners have been asking, what's the deal with this whole theological coordinator and Real Talk with Heath Brady thing?
Yeah.
Because, you know, in case you're not aware, there are different seasons of the Churchosity podcast. And in those seasons, there's some different things kind of happening.
It's kind of like how it's grown over the last year or so.
Right. So I thought that as kind of a precursor to what we want to get into and talk about on this episode, we take a little stroll down memory lane and talk about the evolution of the Churchosity Podcast.
All right.
And how we got to this incredible place that we're at today. So, you know, there was this thing that happened a couple of years ago. You might have heard about it. It's called the pandemic.
No, I haven't heard.
You haven't heard of the pandemic?
Yeah.
So yes, of course.
We were stuck at home a lot.
Yeah, we were trapped at home, and
we needed a creative outlet.
We
right?
needed, we were chomping at the bit. We had things to say. We were excited about doing ministry, and yet everything was closed. And I have a handful of friends that do live streaming, but typically when you think of live streaming, what does that usually pertain to?
Gaming.
Yeah, gaming, the video gaming world.
Right.
So, prior to the pandemic, there were a handful of folks that play video games and live stream, and I just kind of paid attention to what they were doing. And, when you and I and the family have traveled, at times we have gone live on Facebook or Instagram, and
yeah.
I kind of got this little itching to try and do something like that on a regular basis. And so in the middle of the pandemic, when we couldn't go anywhere or do anything or see anyone, I thought, what the heck? Let's start something.
Right.
So the original version of Churchosity Podcast was actually a live stream that started out just on YouTube and then eventually branched out to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. And it was called Real Talk with Heath Brady.
Oh, yes.
And for a while, it was a little bit inconsistent. But then once we kind of got things rolling, we would do a new live stream pretty regularly every single week on Sunday nights. And in the background, a good friend of mine named Josh Loftus, who's actually been on our podcast a couple of times, he has been podcasting for quite a while. And he calls me up one day and he was like, Heath, I really think that you should think about dipping your toes in the waters of podcasting. And I was like, nah, that's not my thing. I don't really like the concept of recording myself. And, I like to interact with people. But then the more that I got to thinking about it, I started to realize that there's a lot more freedom in podcasting.
Yeah. Not only for the creator, but also for the listener. There's a lot more freedom because they can pretty much listen whenever they want.
And they can choose whichever episode they want to listen to as well.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I kicked it around for a while and hemmed and hawed and made it through the holidays and decided, you know what? Let's pull the trigger on this and let's give it a try. Mm-hmm. So a year ago in January, I think it was January 24th of 2021, we launched Churchosity Podcast by taking all of the audio tracks from those live streams and converting them all into podcast episodes.
Oh, yeah.
And then we launched the first official Churchosity Podcast episode with the whole rebrand and all of that stuff. And at that point, I decided to call myself the theological coordinator. Mm-hmm. Even though on some of the live streams I would call myself the theological coordinator, but I've actually been asked, where did that come from? And our youngest son is actually the one that came up with that nickname for me because I love theology and I've been a football offensive coordinator and head coach for 19 years. Yeah. So he just kind of slammed it together and said, Dad, you should call yourself the theological coordinator.
Makes sense.
And I kind of like the sound of it.
Yeah.
So anyhow, throughout the course of that season, that first season of Churchosity Podcast, which technically is season 2, I did several series on several different topics having to do with church history and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And I brought you on, Andy, as a guest a couple of times. Mm-hmm. And then when we did our series on church hurt and spiritual abuse,
right,
the infamous series entitled You Are Not Alone, you appeared regularly as my sidekick through all but one of those episodes.
Yeah.
And we kind of realized, we're kind of good at this together.
Well, it's kind of fun working together.
Yeah. And so we talked about it and we decided that you should be my regular co-host.
I'm the sidekick.
No, you are not the sidekick. You are the co-host.
Oh, okay.
You got promoted.
All right.
And so we branched out and started a whole new thing with Churchosity, and you became my regular co-host and helping to contribute with the content that we create. And man, I just can't even imagine doing Churchosity Podcast without you now.
Oh, thank you.
And I've tried one episode solo.
You did?
Yeah, when we first moved.
Oh,
because you had a bunch of business you had to handle, and we needed to record an episode, and so I rode solo on that one, and numbers and data don't lie. Our listeners really like you.
Aw, thank you. I appreciate it.
So that's kind of, in a nutshell, a brief overview of how the Churchosity Podcast has gone, and lo and behold, we're still going strong, and we're now recording, as we speak, our 50th episode.
I can't believe it.
Yeah.
Wow.
And 50 is kind of an interesting and intriguing number for our family this year.
Yes.
Our listeners may or may not know this, but we are huge fans of Disney. And this year, Disney World turned 50. It was back in October, but they turned 50.
Yeah, that's right.
That's pretty exciting. Mm-hmm. And our podcast is hitting its 50th episode.
Yep. And you're hitting 50.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, in just a couple of weeks, I, ladies and gentlemen, am turning 50 years old.
Oh, my.
So,
wow.
Hence the title of our episode, Welcome to 50. So, yeah, all things 50 on this episode. Mm-hmm. So, Andy, when we were talking about prepping for this episode and the content we wanted to have, you came up with a really great idea.
Well, I thought it would be fun to keep this episode kind of lighthearted and fun, to go back through the decades and talk a little bit about some of the current events and things that we remember from those decades, and things that influenced us in our life, maybe. Or we can also talk a little bit about fashions. I'd like to hear from you what you remember from the decades of our lives.
That could be kind of cool.
Things that you'd like to wear, fashions that you remember. Could be clothing, it could be hairstyles, it could be events that shook the world, etc.
Yeah. So just for clarification, you want to talk about stuff that happened in each of the 5 decades of our lives.
If we can think back that far.
If I can remember back that far.
I know it might be hard.
So I guess that means that we go back and take a bird's eye view from the 1970s, ladies and gentlemen.
Back into the 70s.
And the wheel had already been invented, just for our younger audience's clarification.
That's correct. We had the telephone, we had the television, and we had cars.
Yeah, but telephones were landlines.
Yes, corded.
Corded phones, and they were like, the phone had its own room in the house. I remember that. That was crazy. So, the 1970s. Well, you know, if I think back, probably the most historical event that I can think of that happened in the 70s was the Iran hostage crisis.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
When there was, I forget how many Americans, but I remember there was a lot. And they were held hostage in Iran for like 100 days or something like that.
Yeah, I don't remember. I do remember that happening, but I don't know the details because I was pretty young then.
And you know, just as a side note, a few years back, there was a movie that came out that starred Ben Affleck called Argo. Mm-hmm. And it's a different event during the same time period, but it's based on something that actually happened in Iran at the American embassy, where there were Americans who worked at the American embassy in Iran that went into hiding.
Oh, yeah.
And we had this covert operation that almost didn't happen, that almost failed to get them out. And I remember seeing that movie thinking, man, why did we never learn about this in school? Because I have no memory of learning this in school.
There's a lot of things we didn't learn in school.
Oh, yeah, but we're not going to go there on this episode.
Not on this episode, no.
Yeah, but I do remember the Iran hostage crisis, and I remember when I was a freshman in high school many years later, I actually did a report on that whole thing. So, yeah, I remember that pretty well.
Yeah. I remember there being a gas shortage, and if you needed to get gasoline, you'd have to drive down to the gas station. You might be waiting in a very long line. Some of the lines would wrap around the block, and I just remember that was a really big deal.
You know, I have absolutely no memory of that at all. That's weird.
Yeah.
But that might be because when I was little, my stepdad was in a band, and he was gone all the time on the road. And where we lived, where we grew up, we could pretty much walk to everything. So that might be why I don't remember it. But
that's true. We walked a lot too around the neighborhood.
But I do know that was a thing. I do remember like reading about that at some point in my life.
Yeah. Well, because we were so little in the 70s, I mean, I don't remember that much as far as current events or things that were happening.
It's weird to think that the year I was born was the same year as Watergate. 1972.
That is weird. You know, you could go to the store and you can buy those little birthday cards or cards for people and say, the year you were born, and then it lists all this stuff, and I'm like, yeah, I don't remember any of that.
Oh, man, we should have done that. I could have totally cheated on this episode.
Well, obviously, I don't remember that. I was kind of a baby.
Yeah. What were some of the trendy things or fads when we were kids in the 70s?
Lots of browns and oranges. Lots of stripes.
Bell bottoms.
Bell bottoms, yes. I remember wearing some striped bell bottom pants. Let's see. I had those shorts that were kind of, they were blue, and then they had like a little white stripe around the edges.
Oh, those generic gym shorts that everybody wore.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, with the elastic waist.
Right. I remember that a lot of the boys in the 70s wore belly shirts.
Ah. Oh, man.
And some of them were like mesh.
Yes.
They're see-through.
Oh, yeah. I remember Farrah Fawcett flips. I don't know if, like, on your hair, you'd feather it back a little bit. Maybe that was, like, late 70s. Early 70s, I just had really long, straight hair. Yeah.
I didn't have long enough hair to feather it. But I did have a bowl cut, just like every other boy in the 70s.
Yeah, bowl cuts.
Yeah. Wow, the 70s were pretty gross, especially because that's when disco was popular.
Right.
Remember all the disco sucks posters that were everywhere?
Yes.
Yeah, disco.
Did you ever have a pogo stick?
I did.
So did I.
For about 2 days.
And it broke?
No, because I fell and scraped my left leg from ankle to knee on it.
Oh, no.
Yeah, my mother took it away.
Oh.
That was my version of the Red Ryder BB gun from Christmas Story. I didn't shoot my eye out, but I scraped up my leg pretty bad. And my mother warned me about it.
Well, next we're going to go to the 80s.
The 80s.
I think we're moving on
the
up.
infamous 80s. Oh, I miss the 80s so much.
I remember a lot from the 80s.
Yeah, because we were teenagers in the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that was when Reagan was shot.
Yes,
President Ronald
that.
Reagan was shot in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what's really scary about that incident in history, I was at school, and I think I was either in the 4th or 5th grade when this happened. And I was at school, and the announcement came over the radio that the president had been shot. And so I was so young, and I didn't really fully understand like the magnitude of that because I was still pretty little in the 4th grade. But then what I did hear and what caught my attention on the radio was that James Brady had been shot.
Oh.
Now, what's creepy about that is that my stepdad's name was James Brady.
Oh, gee.
So I'm freaking out.
That's scary.
And at that young of age, I took public transportation. So I was on the Metro bus as soon as I could to get home as fast as I could to find out if my stepdad was okay. Come to find out, it wasn't my stepdad, obviously.
Yeah. Right, but just the same name. And to
Yeah,
hear
it was
that,
really
oh,
creepy.
That would have been scary.
But I remember sitting on the couch with my mom for hours watching the news. It was probably for like 6 hours. Watching them replay over and over and over again from every angle they could come up with in slow motion, regular speed, whatever,
Wow.
Reagan being shot.
Yeah, I remember that too. I remember the Pope being shot.
Oh, yeah.
That was a big deal because I went to Catholic school, so we were really, really, really upset, obviously.
Yeah, I remember that too.
Yeah, Pope John Paul II, I think. Yep, that's right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Hey, I remember something.
What's that?
Princess Diana and Prince Charles's wedding.
Oh, there you are with your royal family passion.
Yee, I love it. Yeah, that was 1981, in case anyone was wondering.
It was that long ago?
Yeah.
Wow.
I remember, okay, of course, her dress, the long train. I mean, a lot of little girls remember that because it was a big deal. But she came rolling up in some kind of crystal carriage or something, too, and it was really amazing.
It was total Cinderella.
Yeah. Yes, I loved it.
Some of the fads and trends from the 80s.
Yes.
The original Atari 2600, where we played asteroids and Space Invaders and thought we were cool.
Yeah, definitely. What about the Rubik's Cube?
Oh, the Rubik's Cube.
That
yes.
was my thing.
That was totally your thing.
Yeah, that was my thing.
We used to go roller skating a lot in the 80s,
Yeah.
especially the early 80s.
I was not a very good roller skater at all.
That was kind of my thing.
Yeah.
I think I learned how to roller skate before I could walk. But you know what was the thing that all of us kids did?
What?
We went to the mall.
Yes. It was
Remember when the mall was an event?
Oh, the mall.
Like you even if you went with your family, you'd meet up in the middle of the mall and you'd be like, okay, we're going to meet back here in an hour, and then we'd all break and go do our own thing, right?
Yeah.
Gosh, I miss the old days in the 80s when we could go to the old Northgate Mall in Seattle.
You know what I was reminded of the other day? I don't know how many of you out there can relate to this, but at Christmas time at the mall, it was a really big deal. But how many people went to Nordstrom and paid $0.25 to get one of those great big awesome Nordstrom shopping bags.
Oh, yes.
So that you could walk around the mall and look like you bought a bunch of stuff from an expensive store.
Right. Everybody was like, oh, they shopped at Nordstrom.
Yeah.
They shopped at Nordy's.
That was the first thing I would do when I went to the mall, is go straight to Nordstrom and get that shopping bag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you were always cool anyway.
Aw. I don't know about that. What about fashions? How about Swatch Watch?
Oh, the Swatch Watch, yes. Anyone who was anyone owned a Swatch Watch. And if you owned more than one Swatch Watch, you were considered rich.
And you wore them both at the same time.
You wore them both at the same time, that's right.
Yeah.
Along with your matching Converse All-Stars.
Ooh.
Yeah, those were pretty popular too. What about mullets?
I am never going to hate on the mullet.
You're never going to hate on the mullet?
No, I'm never going to hate on the mullet.
You just don't want it ever to come back.
You had the most beautiful mullet.
I did.
Because when you say mullet, I think of you. Because you had the best mullet.
Oh, I like to think that my mullet would have made Billy Ray Cyrus jealous.
It did. Yes. How about big bangs with Aquanet hairspray?
Oh, yes.
That was me.
Yeah.
I have to admit.
And the stretch pants, which are now called leggings.
Yes.
With your oversized sweaters or rayon shirts.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, totally happening.
Guys were wearing turtlenecks underneath their long sleeve dress shirts.
Girls too, if they were preppy, and we'd wear penny loafers.
Oh yeah, everybody wore penny loafers, and the guys and the girls too. But we would wear jeans, and we would peg them.
Yes,
you remember that? Mm-hmm. That was a thing, y'all.
Yep. If we had burgundy penny loafers, we'd put pennies in them, and if we had black penny loafers, we'd put silver in them.
Yeah, usually. Well, my feet were so huge, I'd put nickels in them. Oh, the 80s were wonderful, weren't they?
Yeah.
Well, let's move forward.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's talk about the 90s. Now, the 90s are pretty special if you lived in Seattle.
Oh, yeah.
Because Seattle in the 90s is when grunge was born.
Yeah, it was the thing.
And I will tell you, I have never really ever liked grunge music, ever. I like to call it garbage disposal music.
Hey, it is not at all. Whatever.
Well, it's not the death metal music, but grunge music. The only reason why I even like listening to grunge music, and when I think of grunge music, I think of Nirvana,
Pearl Jam,
who were like the godfathers of grunge.
Yeah.
Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, mainly because they're from Seattle. Mm-hmm. If I had lived anywhere else in the world when grunge music was born, I would have absolutely hated it. I'm just saying. But it was always kind of cool to know that I was born, raised, and living in the place where grunge music was born in the 90s.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. Oh, yeah, so like in the 90s, of course, we had the grunge music, and then Kurt Cobain died. That was a big deal in Seattle.
Right.
I remember that.
That was like 93, 94, something like that?
94.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, in the 90s, Princess Diana's death.
You and the royal family.
Well, it was huge news.
It was.
So that was 1997, I believe. And I remember I woke up one morning, went out and got the newspaper. Yeah, I got the newspaper.
What's a newspaper?
Anyhow, the front news said that she had been killed in a car accident in Paris, and I was absolutely shocked.
She was running from the paparazzi, wasn't she? Yeah.
Yeah. It was so awful.
Yeah. Flannels were a big thing in the 90s.
Yep.
Everybody wore flannels.
Doc Martens.
Doc Martens, yes.
Birkenstocks.
Birkenstocks. Tracksuits were a thing.
Oh,
like Adidas sweatsuits. Especially in the early 90s. Those were pretty popular. And that might have been more of an East Coast thing. When I remember, like, in the early 90s when like the boy band thing became huge.
Oh, yes.
A lot of those East Coast boy bands were wearing sweatsuits.
Yeah, they were.
I recently watched a movie that was a period piece that took place in the 90s, and it was in Boston, and every single guy that was a main character in that movie was wearing sweatsuits.
Oh, that's funny. That's really funny.
I think that television kind of got crazy in the 90s, too. There was a lot of huge shows that were popular in the 90s.
Oh, yeah, like Seinfeld and Friends.
Yeah, 2 shows that I never watched.
2 shows that I always watched.
Yeah. Again, not a big fan of comedies, and those just never took for me.
Oh.
I was more into the science fiction or the drama TV shows, like Star Trek Next Generation or ER.
Oh, okay.
ER was my show.
Yeah.
My favorite movie of all time, well, technically my favorite movie of all time is Peter Pan. We've talked about this on a previous episode. But my favorite movie with human beings in it came out in the 90s.
Which was?
JFK.
Oh, yes, JFK.
Yeah. You know, there was a big event that actually happened at the end of the 90s.
Y2K.
Y2K. Now, for those of you who are Gen Z, and maybe some of you younger millennials, you may not know or may not have ever heard about Y2K. But this was a mass hysteria that started at the end of the 90s in the computing industry because they realized, and this is when like Microsoft Windows was really huge, they realized that when they designed all of their hardware, that they didn't create the date spaces in the hard drives to 4 characters. It was only 2. And so when the clock would strike midnight on New Year's Eve of 1999 and turn to 2000, everybody was afraid that everything in the world that had to do with the computer was going to crash and the whole world was going to fall apart.
I do remember that. Everyone was freaking out.
And so it was called the Y2K, year 2000. And so, like, every single person in the world stayed up that night, not to celebrate New Year's Eve, but to prepare for, like, Armageddon.
Yeah, pretty much.
And what's really sad for us Gen Xers is most of us grew up listening to Prince's song 1999.
Yes.
And none of us really did get to party like it was 1999.
No kidding. I know.
Like Y2K totally killed our joy for that.
That's the truth.
So then we move into the 2000s.
Right. Of course, 9/11 happened.
9/11 happened, yeah.
At the very beginning in 2001.
Yeah.
And I think that is the most significant world event that's ever happened in my lifetime.
I think I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Because for our generation, that is like the Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
You know, we were attacked on American soil. Several thousand innocent lives were lost. Mm-hmm. It was an act of terror. Yeah. And that event, it's changed the way that pretty much everything in the world is done now.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Well, something rather fascinating and earth-shaking happened in 2008.
What's that?
Barack Obama was elected to be our first black president.
That's right.
In the United States of America.
Yep.
That was so incredible and awesome.
That was.
And remember what I said to you when Barack and Michelle were dancing at the inauguration ball.
What, that it was nice to have someone who could dance in the White House?
What I said after that.
That it was nice that a president was absolutely crazy about his wife.
And that she was crazy about him in return.
That's right.
And I don't think I've really ever seen that since, and especially before. Maybe with W.
Maybe, yeah. Him and Laura.
Yeah.
Yeah.
George W. and Laura.
They're kind of cute.
They were kind of smitten with each other.
Yeah.
But there were times where I would see Laura look at W and I would think, I don't think she's crazy about him. I think she's just very, very skilled in how to handle him.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Whatever it is, it works, right?
He's like that overly curious 4-year-old boy in a restaurant. Someone's got to keep an eye on him.
That's right.
My favorite television show came out in the 2000s.
What was that?
Smallville.
Oh, yeah, Smallville.
I believe it was 2003, actually.
Wow.
That Smallville launched.
Yep.
And there was this fad that exploded in America, at least in the Puget Sound area in the Pacific Northwest, Karaoke.
Oh, yeah.
It was everywhere.
Yeah.
And small little factoid about Heath Brady.
Oh, no.
I ran a karaoke show of my own for a little over a year.
I don't believe it.
I did. And you know what? I was good. So that brings us to 2010 through the present.
Yeah.
Lots of weird, crazy, fun, and wonderful things have all happened in the last, 10, 20 years.
I have to say that technology has changed and grown so much in the last 10 years.
It really has.
Just by leaps and bounds, it seems. That things that are possible now, we're just only like maybe a concept 10 years ago.
Or on somebody's dream board in a board meeting somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like, think about how the majority of us watch television shows or movies now.
Yeah.
Like, we stream them. Like, I don't really know anybody, unless they don't own a DVR or have internet, that watches television in real time anymore.
Yeah, I don't either.
I know that, like, the gaming industry is huge now, which led to live streaming, which is part of, like, what we're doing now, podcasts.
Yeah, and smartphones.
Oh, gosh, I know.
I mean, 10 years ago, smartphones were just kind of a thing that was starting, and I remember thinking, I don't really need a smartphone, do I? What would I use that for?
I remember us having that conversation. Like, I don't need that. I just need to call and text people. I don't need to have the internet. I don't need to check my email. I don't need any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And now?
Oh, now I can't imagine not having a smartphone.
Because we're walking around with our entire existence in our pockets now.
It's so weird.
We've had some crazy stuff happen over the last couple of decades, too. Like, think about remember that Malaysia flight that vanished?
Oh, yeah.
There was like 239 passengers on it, and the plane took off and just disappeared.
Yeah, and they haven't found
They
it.
still haven't. They haven't found evidence. Nothing.
Oh, wow.
How does that work?
I don't know.
I mean, I don't even think they flew into the Bermuda Triangle.
I don't think so either. That's really scary.
Yeah. Well, the last 50 years have been quite the roller coaster ride for us, I think.
I think so.
But I think that at the end of the day, even though we mentioned a lot of stuff that was not so fun, or maybe even depressing for some of us, at the end of the day, there's so much more positive that I think back on over the last 5 decades of my life.
Yeah.
And probably the greatest thing that's happened to me is that I get to be married to you.
Oh, thank you, honey.
That's probably the most freaking phenomenal thing that's ever happened in my life. Is that I am married to you.
Oh. That's pretty awesome. I enjoy it. Every day's a new adventure.
I'll be sure and give you that $20 later.
Yes.
And so now we give you this week's proof that we're living in the last days.
Well, something did happen this week that made me think maybe we are living in the last days.
Okay.
My local dollar store is no longer a dollar store. It's a $1.25 store.
Oh, my gosh.
I was pretty shocked.
Yeah, they got to change the signs. It's not the Dollar Tree anymore. It's the $1.25 tree.
Yeah. How does that happen?
I don't know.
I guess it was inevitable, but it was kind of a shock. I never really expected that to happen.
Right. It is really, really interesting. I don't know what it's like for the rest of the country, but especially in the Pacific Northwest, we are always looking to find a good deal.
Yeah.
And when the dollar store raises its prices from $1 to $1.25, that's highway robbery.
Yeah, no kidding.
And actually might be proof that we are, in fact, living in the last days.
And that's all we have to say about that.
Thank you for tuning into another episode, this monumental episode of the Churchosity Podcast, the show where we try to give you the Gen X take on church culture. And thank you once again, as always, to my amazing wife and co-host.
Oh, thank you. Be sure to follow us on all the socials. That's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle is @Churchosity Pod. Drop us a message and give us your feedback because we'd really love to hear from you.
And if you happen to be listening to this episode on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please be sure to give us a rating and leave a comment. And don't forget to help spread the word about the Churchosity Podcast by telling a friend to tell a friend what we're doing here.
Yeah, let them be a part of the conversation too.
But always remember that the goal of our instruction is love.
From a pure heart.
And from a good conscience.
And a sincere faith.
So, we thank you all once again for listening. What a ride, hasn't it been, Andy?
Yep, and here's to 50 more.
Here's to 50 more, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Churchosity Podcast. Peace.